I was asked to speak to the U.S. in both Iraq and Afghanistan, but I'm actually going to speak to both the U.S. and the U.K. because all my time downrange since '06 has been pretty much equally shared between the two militaries themselves. So, as we all know, war is extremely difficult and ugly. War is not cheap. Counterinsurgency? Whatever. War is not cheap. The first theme, and I'm going to hit each one of these in a little bit more detail. The first one is there was a lack of clear and realistic strategic debate for the use of force for both the US and UK. When we crossed that line of departure to go to war, some of those debates were the most juvenile debates we've ever seen in my country. People forgot what war is. People forgot what sacrifice is. There were breakdowns in civil relationships on both sides of the Atlantic, and we're still living with them today. The most damaging was there are major breakdowns in the relationship between the two key allies of the US and UK. The nice thing was there was tactical reform by both the US and UK. However, tactics without strategy is noise before defeat. We adapted to a war, not just a coin. And the fifth one is that there are problems with ignoring that there was a mosaic of the battlefield and attempting to apply simplistic narratives and solutions to complex wars. The evidence that I'm going to talk about today is from countless meetings with governments on both sides of the Atlantic, but a lot of it comes down to personal experience. Since '06, I have been with 65 battalions, 27 brigades, 14 divisions, 10 corps, and multiple commanders of both MNFI and COM-ISAF. But I'll tell you that 80% of those men and women that I worked with understood the need for width, depth, and context to their understanding of those wars and the wars we're in still today. So let's deal with the first, probably the most important one, and that is lack of strategic debate. As I said, the decision-making and the debates for the use of force in both Afghanistan and Iraq were nowhere near as robust as they should have been. Committing to war, one does not know where it will end, does not know if it will escalate. You can never forecast what level of sacrifice potentially you're going to embark on. And if you can't have those debates up front, don't send the troops. We entered into a civil war in Afghanistan, hunting down al-Qaeda. We knew that right after 9/11, but some people chose to look to the left or look to the right. We invaded Iraq and created a civil war. Our national interest and the UK's national interest were never clearly defined in either campaign. And as you can see, they fundamentally changed between 2001 and we're still there for us. To give you an example of what I mean by this lack of debate, at the end of '02, at a CENTCOM meeting with Paul Wolfowitz, a senior British general told me this story about how he worked with a senior American general. Typical American general at the time, never smoked, never drank, never swore. And Wolfowitz came in, talked about how they're going to spread democracy throughout the Middle East. The Israeli-Palestinian issue will be resolved. Kumbaya, we'll all hold hands and drink tea, I guess. This American general turned to the Brit and said, excuse my language, "We're fucked." It's actually not that funny, because the British general turned to him and said, "Well, then why don't you say we're fucked?" And he said, "It's not my job. I will get him to Baghdad. Let the policymakers decide." Senior generalship had pulled themselves out of the strategic debate about the use of force, about the use of their institutions and the greater good of so-called national interest. So when people go on about phase 4 is a plan. It is not a strategy. Ends, ways, and means ain't strategy. The surge, heresy here, because I was guilty of it too when I was in the middle of the surge. We saw progress, tactical progress. It wasn't a strategy. It was a plan. Now, the nice thing for the US, and I think it's true across the pond in the UK, is that since 2001, many of the senior generals today are asking, to what end? Not that they're tired, they're professional, and they'll do what their country tells them. But they're now asking, to what end? Civ Mill issues. In both the US and UK, relations broke down at different times. Everybody blamed each other for the failures of 01 or 03. The former head of the British military, Sir David Richards, Lord Richards now, pushed the government about the issue of the covenant, the relationship between society and the military, because of the debacles in Basra and the issues in Helmand. The recent Chilcot Commission out of the UK, people only focus on the decision-making going to war instead of focusing on huge points in that report about the breakdown between government and the military. I will say that many on both sides of the Atlantic feel that there's been a dereliction of duty once again in both camps, both civilian as well as military. And that's what we're trying to work through. Breakdown in trust with allies. There was in this relationship, there was arrogance from day one when the US felt that they could go in and fight against Al-Qaeda and take down the Taliban with no impact on itself, or that they could take down Saddam Hussein and everybody would throw flowers on them and all would be good. But then the British were equally arrogant as well. They knew everything because of Northern Ireland. They knew how to do stabilization. The last time Britain invaded the country was a long time ago. So I do question sometimes when people say, well, if they'd only listened to us about phase 4, if they've only listened to us, they could have done X or Y. But I'm not sure the last time Australia ever invaded a country and actually faced that kind of level of occupation. So I think we all have to have a bit of hubris and think about it. We're all out of our depths in 03. We all went for the ride, but we're all guilty of making the same mistakes. And the arrogance from the Brits came back to bite them, of course, because tactically the US Marines, the US Army, adapted to the ground a lot faster than the British. And of course, the low mark for that relationship was by 2008, when most people in MNFI or MNCI, meaning the headquarters in Baghdad, when reports came up from Basra, they weren't quite sure what they were listening to. I wrote a report in February 2007 that went to the Chief of the General Staff in the UK. As an American, he found it amusing. I wrote, quote, I was upset with what I saw and heard in Basra. This is my third trip already in 6 months. This may sound a bit over the top, but the honor of the British Army and its reputation is at stake. Overall, the mood amongst many British officers is frustration. They want to be boots on the ground 24/7 as they perceive the Yanks in the north. Allow the boys on the ground to storm back into Basra, start up company bases with the embedded Iraqis, and think long term. Get the British Army thinking more about the long term and less about force protection. The last thing we need is for a U.S. Army Marine Regiment or U.S. Army Brigade to come south in the future to do their job with the Iraqis. Such an eventuality will be humiliating for the British Army. Sadly, the end result was a year later, when the last brigade commander, if you could say, of sort of the questioning about this mission as they're pulling back from inside Basra because the focus now is the so-called good war in Afghanistan. Well, they were wrong on that one. They came back and they started to debate. What should they do about Basra? The 14th Iraqi Division is supposed to take back Basra, but what will the Brits do? His orders through the two-star were pull back and everybody close up shop and hand it over to General Mohan. We had a very contentious meeting where I did tell this general, great general in the end, you have a choice. Turn out the lights go home with your tail between your legs, or start the debate higher up, PGHQ, start the debate with MNFI. The Brits may be willing to work with the Iraqis to go back into Basra. The Charge of the Knights was launched 4 months too early, but he had already started to prepare the ground about getting his British troops embedded into the Iraqi army. He put his career on the line, went against PGHQ, put in resources, including British troops, before the PGHQ gave him the clearance. They gave him the clearance in retrospect 2 days later. He was very upfront in his after-action review about the Charge of the Knights. He wrote, quote, "The opening moves of the Charge of the Knights did indeed expose our lack of situational awareness and lack of resources to take the fight to the enemy. This led to the Iraqis and the Americans doubting our commitment and ability and tarnished our reputation. Things were streamlined for Afghanistan and their NCC and their selection of commanders in both Helmand as well as the 3-star positions in Kabul. They didn't have a separate thing. They were embedded in the system as the deputy commander. They found that it worked well for them, but they were in a kind of different phase of the campaign for them. But there was arrogance again from the US now in 2007 and 2008. Many people walked around Iraq as if we had won the war. The war wasn't over. We knew best. We had all the answers. We had all the narratives. Everybody going to Afghanistan were getting nervous. They're thinking, oh God, here come those Iraqi veterans, and they're going to tell us what we need to do in Afghanistan. Even the Marines were saying to their guys before they went out to Helmand, Afghanistan is not Iraq. The people, culture, terrain, climate, and nature of the enemy differ greatly between the two areas. Every war is different. There are many Iraqi hands out there looking for the Anbar tribal awakening again. Forgetting, of course, the fundamental difference between the tribes, if you want to call them that, especially in RC South and Southwest, a lot of them don't exist, and RC East tribes and the tribes of Anbar in Iraq. But you know, cookie cutter solutions, the narratives, just put it on top, all will be fine. But let's deal with a positive, tactical reform. Reform was generally bottom up in both campaigns, wars. It was slowly tied to continental US and the UK commands. There's a huge disconnect lots of times. In the end, though, the learning curve that occurred was down to time-honored traditions of staring defeat in the face, and that's what happens when you're the lead coalition member. It always falls on you if you win or lose. And learning from the battlefield and the desire to win. It was a transformation of units and formations to defeat the enemy, whoever that may be. US Army, US Marine Corps, and the British Army tactically adapted to a war. This was not a coin moment. Reform in both Iraq and Afghanistan occurred within the US military well before General Petraeus rocking up on the scene, or the so-called 3-24 revolution. The Petraeus and the 324 moment, you might say, provided the needed top cover for units and formations and commanders in both theaters. The issue now is there's a post-war narrative that is completely different from the reality. I'll give you two examples. A British officer in 2006 stating in Afghanistan, quote, "We must avoid dressing coin up as something fundamentally new. We must be wary of losing sight of lessons from previous campaigns. Additionally, in previous counterinsurgency campaigns, war fighting is an element of coin. Many of the lessons are not new from the battle group's resulting experiences. Common themes from previous UK coin campaigns, as well as war fighting, were all evident in operations in Helmand. The key lesson is that we ignore previous experience of such campaigns and those of our allies at our peril." It was astonishing to watch this reform. The problem, though, is now there's lack of reflection, lack of debate, lack of ripping it apart to figure out actually what happened to us in those previous campaigns. Because we're all too busy. We're on to the next one. So let's deal with the last one, the mosaic of the battlefield. There were issues with the blanket solutions and narratives for the various districts and provinces in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Just on the military side, in terms of the domain, Basra was different from Anbar, and Mosul was different from Anbar, as well as Baghdad. RC South was different from RC Southwest, and RC East was completely different from those two. Each year of the campaign in Iraq and Afghanistan was different to the next year or the previous year. This is true in all wars. Anybody who studied Vietnam, you know Phuoc Tuy was not Quang Tri province, but we have a common narrative about the campaign even in Vietnam. Battlefield commanders saw the differences, but is not clearly as visible due to the simple narratives that have taken hold in this post-war period. Now, I'll quote another report that went to COM-ISAF in 2010. Quote, while this concept may be obvious at the COM-ISAF level, there's a need for clear and consistent recognition that each of the battalion's area of operations will have different solutions, and that the commanders need to be allowed to develop these different solutions and pass along their knowledge operating within the remit of higher command. It must also be recognized and made clear that all lessons may not be applied everywhere. Each area of operation needs to be allowed to come up with its own solutions in order to succeed. There's a need to share information and lessons, but all commanders understand there's no silver bullet. Sometimes COM-ISAF's directives, which are now guidance, have been interpreted as black and white. Clarity in communications is essential, and I always have to do this in my reports. With due respect to the chain of command, the colonels of the area of operations need to feel confident that they are right to use their own judgment in tailoring solutions for their own battle space. It's not mission command. That's just war, and that's always what's happened. So I don't take that argument, yes, about mission command. That's something completely different. So on that note, I'll leave you with this note. And my point is, back in 2001, back in 2002, sadly, we didn't have the debates about what that means. We thought we could go off and do very simple campaigns. We didn't want to call them wars, of course, because that sends another message to the people. And we wanted to, get in, get out, get in, get out. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves in a mission creep, and we find ourselves at the end of these campaigns, some of them are not over yet, thinking, what did we just do? Because there was a lack of debate at strategic level. So I'm guilty of a person who was on the ground all the time, seeing progress tactically, hoping for the best, closing your eyes, saying we're going to do it this year, and then I'm in West Mosul again. Leave it on that happy note.